There are few stories or legends more fun than those starring the hairy ape man of the forest we all know and love today as Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Though primarily a legendary cryptid resident of North America, stories resound globally of a subhuman hairy creature inhabiting the wilder, less traveled places. Even if we ignore the accounts of backwood country folk and fame-seeking townspeople, still many stories of this legendary beast sound perhaps credible, and many of them feature famous historical figures we've come to respect today. I'm Johnny the Folklore Guy, and these are 8 famous historical figures to encounter Bigfoot. Before we begin, may I remind you, Mortar and Ivy regularly posts material dedicated to analyzing the more curious aspects of history and legend. If I have piqued your interest, feel free to subscribe and enable notifications so you don't miss our next fun take on the glorious past. Liking the vid don't hurt neither. The name Bigfoot was coined by the media following the discovery of giant footprints at a lumbering site by Ray Wallace in 1958. While it was later revealed Wallace fabricated and perpetuated this 60-year hoax, stories of a giant hairy wild man were by no means new, and until roughly the 1960s, especially by the release of the infamous Patterson-Gimlin film, it was thought Bigfoot was typically a large wild species of man, and not a separate ape-like entity. Therefore, in studying historical accounts of the beast, we typically find stories of large, hairy, unkempt people, and not an oversized forest monkey. These stories are ranged by most fantastic to most likely, and or least famous to considerably renowned. That said, let's dive in, carrying with us perhaps a bushel of salt. Number 8. Davy Crockett. One famous Tennessee native and later Texas icon is politician and folk hero David Crockett, better known as Davy, to whom belong many tall tales, including killing a bear with a knife at only 3 years old. And it is no surprise that such a source of folk legends may have encountered a larger, hairier folk legend. In Crockett's correspondence with a brother-in-law, Abner, Crockett mentions having witnessed something the shape and shade of a large ape man while exploring the Texan interior. According to Crockett, this creature spoke to him in English, warning him to leave the Texas territory and abandon a lost cause. When he implored the beast of what and why he spoke, the creature vanished, in his words, upon the wind like the morning stream swirls off a frog pond. Was Crockett visited by a Sasquatch foretelling the tragic events of the Alamo? Or was it simply a crazed, hair-covered lunatic telling Crockett to get off of his lawn? Scholars debate the meaning of this encounter, chalking it up to perhaps a lively allegory, or perhaps the result of a fatigued and dehydrated imagination. Perhaps it wasn't a person or Bigfoot, but in fact Shrek, warning Crockett to, and I quote, "Get out my swamp." Oh, that was awful. Note to self, remember to remove that in editing. Delete it. Yeah, delete. Number 7. Lewis and Clark. While navigating some rocky, boulder-strewn country in their survey of the Louisiana Purchase, American explorers Meriwether Lewis and William Clark were said to have trespassed in the territory of a wild and lawless people described not unlike the Sasquatch of lore. Lewis depicted these people in his journals as a fierce and warlike nation, whom their native guide called the Broken Moccasins, or moccasins with holes. According to testimony, these creature folk, and I quote, inhabited those mountains and lived like the bear of other countries among the rocks, and fed on roots or the flesh of such horses as they could take or steal from those who passed through their country. It's not impossible to imagine Lewis simply meant an uncivilized, horse-eating, vagabond race of Indians of normal stature and background. Yet no other contemporary accounts describe a tribe as such. These passages remain a modern enigma. That, or Lewis and Clark's native guy was perhaps being too harsh and libelous toward a rival clan. But honestly, Bigfoot seems more likely. I have to say that, otherwise why are we here? Number 6. Leif Erikson. Before Christopher Columbus landed on the shores of the Western Hemisphere, Bigfoot lore was confined to the traditions of native peoples with one exception. Famous Viking explorer and settler Leif Erikson reached the New World nearly 500 years before his Italian counterpart. A Upon settling what they called Vinland, now understood to be Canada's Newfoundland province, these Nordic oceanic nomads encountered many Indians, some of whom they killed during encounters. Passed down through the epic sagas that recorded Erikson's accounts, it is thought these Norse may have discovered something larger, darker, and hairier. These sagas tell of a people of the forest, horribly ugly, hairy, swarthy, odorous men with great black eyes, who filled the woods with unearthly howls. It was said these creature folk attempted to enter the Norse settlement, but scattered in fear, not of the strong, fierce Vikings, mind you, but of the placid, herbivorous cattle that, mind you, were very much foreign to the Americas. Many Bigfoot researchers draw an immediate connection between the forest dwellers described here and the illustrious man-ape of modern day. Yet, by other accounts and by other translations, the sagas indicate they may simply be normal-sized people with strange hair on their heads, not their bodies, and any confusion otherwise is a result of misinterpretation. Some scholars even suggest such people were none other than the Thule branch of the Inuit peoples, who likewise have preserved accounts of meeting strange pale men from the eastern seas. Number 5. Actor Rob Lowe? We transition here from Viking warlords to Hollywood royalty with this next encounter. Actor Rob Lowe claims he was almost killed during a Bigfoot encounter in 2017 while filming the television series The Lowe Files. The show, a passion project, features Lowe and his two sons, John Owen and Matthew, trekking cross-country investigating instances of the paranormal and supernatural, of which Bigfoot comfortably belongs. It was while filming an episode dedicated to the wood ape of the Ozark Mountains he claims a Bigfoot-like creature approached the family's camp. Lowe claimed the creature was behaving aggressively, and the actor believed he and his sons' lives were nothing less than threatened. He stands by his story, despite the self-awareness of how it makes him sound, his quote, like a crazy Hollywood coupe.
Literally?
Number 4, Fred Beck. We shift gears again from famous people who witnessed Bigfoot to a man who became famous as a result from a Bigfoot encounter, perhaps one of the most terrifying. Fred Beck was just one in a group of gold prospectors in the Mount St. Helens region of Washington state in 1924. The group discovered large, unexplained tracks in their area, and by mid-July 1924 they began hearing shrill, peculiar whistling each evening. The whistling, along with a deep, thudding sound, not unlike Bigfoot's alleged wood knocking, sounded to Beck like communication between something on neighboring ridges. It was while collecting water one evening, Beck's group encountered something 100 yards away, about 7 feet tall, and with blackish-brown hair. One member of the group fired shots at it without noticeable impact. Beck, along with Gabe Lefevre, John Pedersen, Marion Smith, and Roy Smith, decided they'd leave at first light the following morning, being thoroughly frightened by the series of encounters. That night, however, would prove the most frightening, though, as the group was awakened by thudding and discovered ape-like creatures surrounding their cabin, armed with boulder projectiles. The creatures eventually tore a hole in the roof and began pelting the prospectors with stones. 2 rocks struck Beck, who lay unconscious for 2 hours as a result. Upon sunrise, the creatures abandoned the siege, and the miners escaped mostly unscathed. The unbelievable story of the ape men's siege on the prospectors' camp became front-page news in the Oregonian, and the story was immediately picked up by national publications, drawing much attention to the area, both curious and skeptical, and making a local celebrity out of Beck. The widespread news and accompanying tales inspired the U.S. Forest Service to launch a high-profile investigation on the area. Nearly 100 years later, the events described by Beck remain a mystery, and the Forest Service never truly discovered what became of the marauding ape men, at least not publicly. Number 3. Sir Edmund Hillary. In 1953, celebrity climbers Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay reported seeing large footprints while scaling Mount Everest. The men determined that they belonged to the Yeti, a legendary beast of local Himalayan folklore. This encounter sparked what became a highly publicized abominable snowman craze in the US and Great Britain. The Daily Mail established a snowman expedition led by mountaineer John Angelo Jackson, who tracked and photographed a number of large, unidentifiable footprints in the snow and exclaimed to be nothing less than the Yeti. Subsequent expeditions by British and American mountaineers came home with what they suspected were Yeti scalps, feces, and other relics of what many consider Bigfoot's Asian cousin. Skeptic scientists have since offered many alternative conclusions to the Yeti remnants, arguing the fabrication of such disembodied scalps and hands, and the tracks being distortions of bear tracks and human tracks that had melted by the sun's rays and refroze. Officially speaking, Sir Edmund never found the abominable snowman. Although he did not conclusively dismiss the possibility of Yeti existence, he would later admit to believing they were probably mythical. Regardless, journalists and adventurers of international renown, as well as Nepalese and Tibetan residents alike, still claim encounters with the Himalayan man-ape, and many likewise offer evidence to support their claims. Number 2. Theodore Roosevelt. Frontiersmen are not, as a rule, apt to be very superstitious. They lead lives too hard and practical, and have too little imagination in things spiritual and supernatural. I've heard but few ghost stories while living on the frontier, and those few were of a perfectly commonplace and conventional type. But I once listened to a goblin story which rather impressed me, wrote celebrity politician frontiersman and later U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt in his book The Wilderness Hunter. This story, unlike previous encounters, passed second-hand to Roosevelt, who had not seen the creature of subject himself. Roosevelt wrote of meeting a man named Bauman, an old grizzled mountain man who'd birthed, lived, and died on the American frontier. Bauman related to TR of trapping game as a young man. Bauman and his trapping partner decided to weather a particularly hazardous stream where years before a solitary hunter had been attacked and half-eaten by something unidentifiable by the prospectors who discovered his remains. The region had an evil reputation. Upon reaching an open glade, the trappers set camp. Leaving camp the next day, they returned to find evidence of a rummage by what they believed was a bear. The footprints left were not startling to Bauman and his friend at first, until a second examination suggested a creature consistently walking on two legs. The men discussed the possibility of a human encounter, but thought little of the account until a rude awakening during the late hours that night. A hulking figure, accompanied by a terrible odor, entered the men's camp that night, awakening them. Bauman shot at the beast, apparently scaring it away. The next day it returned, further rummaging the camp and likewise destroying their shelter. Bauman returned to camp to discover his friend attacked and killed, his neck broken and his body still warm. Horrified, he fled the scene and told the story of his attack by, and loss to, a horrific great goblin beast of the forest. TR relates this story and further mentions his own similar experience in the Pacific Northwest. Guided by a Native American tracker who warned Roosevelt of the superstition of the region, Roosevelt trekked into a particularly wild territory where his group experienced eerie, unsettling noises one night. Roosevelt neither recognized nor described these noises, but he did give the distinct impression that they were unusual and unrelated to any beast or man by he or his guide's prior experience. Number 1. Daniel Boone. Number 1 in this list is perhaps the most compelling, and further involves early 20th century U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt. In this case, a man-like creature, not unlike Bigfoot, is not only seen and heard, but killed. Teddy Roosevelt relates in his 1897 book, Daniel Boone's Move to Kentucky, Boone was encamped with 5 other men on Red River, and they had with them for their amusement the history of Samuel Gulliver's travels. In said novel, 17th and 18th century author Jonathan Swift recounts tales of the Yahoos, wild, uncivilized, deformed, human-like creatures that are ruled over by the talking horse race of Huihinanims. Claims John Mack Farragher in a 1992 biography of Boone, the famous frontiersman proceeds to tell of killing a 10-foot hairy giant he called a Yahoo. It was a tall tale that Boone repeated to a number of people during his last year, one such as he would have told in a winter camp. It be of striking note that early Kentuckian frontier colonists and other native populations of that region recall stories of a similar beast they refer to as the Yaho, which likewise would have spread to Boone. Told by Nancy McDaniel of Big Leatherfoot Creek, Perry County, Kentucky, to folktale collector Leonard Roberts, who published it under the title The Origin of Man in 1955, once upon a time they's a man laying out, and he went to a cave. And he was laying out in there, and the Yaho came and throwed a deer into him. Something would come every day and throw a deer into him and leave out. On time that Yahoo come and got down in there with him, and not long after that, she had a kid. Then one time he took a notion to leave her, and he would go to leave and she wouldn't let him go. She'd make him come back. Finally he got out and he got on a ship going to cross the waters, and he got started and rowed off and left her. And she stood there and hollered and screamed after him, and when she seen he'd got away from her and she couldn't go, why she tore the baby in two and throwed one half in after him. Did Swift inspire Boone? Did Swift inspire native Kentuckians? Or did these tales make it to Swift first, from across the Atlantic, who likewise based his yahoos on an American Bigfoot-like creature? It's difficult to determine who inspired Boone's use of the language first, and there may be likely more than one coincidence afoot. Folktale scholar Hugh H. Trotty suggests that Boone's tall tales may be the origin of some of the Bigfoot tales in North America. That wraps up our list. As always, there's more to say here that's left unsaid. Is there a famous historical figure I left from the list? What do you know of the illustrious man-ape of legend and lore? Leave a comment and we'll report more on the subject later. In the meantime, stay safe y'all when wandering the wilder edges of the American wilderness. I've been Johnny. You're always welcome in my neck of the woods.